"Curtis, get down!" The scream wasn't meant for the noble hero in the crimson sash, but for the wrong brother, the one standing in the shadows of the secondary trap. I flew across the assembly hall, not to save my destiny from the assassin's blade, but to save the man I couldn't bear to lose, instantly sacrificing the truth of my time travel mission for the devastating, exposed truth of my heart. The life of the man I traveled centuries to save hung in the balance, but all that mattered was if the accidental target, the man who saw my soul, would survive the chaos my intervention unleashed. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get into the story. Julian Sterling paused in the suffocating shadows of the carriage house, the 19th century pressing in on her like a velvet shroud. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp earth, a jarring, physical assault after the sterile, humming silence of her lab. Her fingers, still tingling from the temporal discharge, clenched around the fragile leather-bound journal, the only proof of the history she was here to fix. Her modern dress, hastily altered and hidden beneath a borrowed traveling cloak, felt like a screaming secret. She was 28, a physicist, a woman who operated in variables and certainty, yet here she was just an anomaly, a ghost trying to save a life that should have been her destiny. The date, October 10th, was seared behind her eyes like a countdown clock. She adjusted the pearl earrings, her only aristocratic disguise, and whispered the name, Reed Donovan. He was the legacy, the noble portrait on her great-great-grandmother's mantelpiece, the promise she traveled centuries to honor. He was the reason. With a sharp, determined inhale, Julian pushed open the heavy oak door leading to the grand hall, choosing to walk into the firelight and the music. The moment was not one of hope, but of irreversible commitment. The hall unfurled before her in a breathtaking, golden haze of candlelight and crystal. The music swelled around her. A waltz too slow, too rigid, too perfect. And then, at the top of the grand staircase, she saw them. Reed, commanding in a deep crimson sash and formal collar, his gaze intense, a man sculpted by duty and power, the true love of her future, standing exactly where history said he would be. And right beside him, impeccably dressed but with a fluid, modern ease, was Curtis. His eyes, lighter and filled with immediate, unexpected curiosity, locked with hers. The world fractured. The music died in Julian's ears, and the scientist who lived by logic realized, in one terrifying, beautiful moment, that her heart was rushing not towards the history she knew, but towards the present she had never anticipated. The carriage, smelling strongly of polished leather and ancient wood, lurched violently, jolting Julie and from the terrifying kaleidoscope of her temporal journey. She pressed her fingers against the cool glass window, trying to anchor herself to the reality of the 19th century London night. She was no longer Julian Sterling, PhD candidate in theoretical physics, but Miss Julian Sterling from the American colonies, a vaguely defined relative sent abroad for her education and health, a backstory just thin enough to be plausible in this world of strict societal scrutiny. The lie felt like a fragile, transparent sheet wrapped around a grenade. The moment she stepped onto the cobbled drive of the Donovan estate, her focus narrowed. Everything was a distraction. The overwhelming scent of gas lamps mixed with lilac, the crunch of gravel under the carriage wheels, the relentless, suffocating quiet compared to the perpetual buzz of 21st century New York. Her only anchor was the mission, October 27th, the date of Reed Donovan's assassination, the date that fractured her family line and plunged generations into tragedy. She was shown into the formal receiving room, a space of intimidating dark wood and intimidating high ceilings. She waited, her heart thrumming against her ribs not from fear of her lie being discovered, but from the urgency of the ticking clock. Her disguise was good, her cover story rehearsed until it felt like a native language, but every minute spent admiring antique draperies was a minute wasted on finding the plot. The door opened, and Julianne's rehearsed composure nearly shattered. Reed Donovan entered first. He was even more imposing in person than in the faded oil paintings she'd studied. Dressed in the severe black coat of an aristocrat, his posture was ramrod straight, radiating a palpable sense of gravity and command. The left figure from her memory, a man carved from granite and duty. His dark eyes swept over her with an assessing, formal air. This was the man she had loved an idea of, the noble hero whose early demise had warranted her crossing centuries. Miss Sterling. His voice was deep, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. Welcome to our home. I am Reed Donovan, the elder brother. My father sends his regards. He is unfortunately indisposed with parliamentary matters. He offered a brief, cool hand that she barely grazed. The physical contact was an anticlimax. There was no spark, only a sense of profound, formal distance. He was the epitome of duty, and in his presence, Julianne felt reduced to a bureaucratic task. Thank you, Mr. Donovan. The journey was illuminating. She forced a smile she hoped looked demure, but her mind was already racing. How do I warn him without sounding insane? How do I get close enough to protect him without raising suspicion? Reed frowned slightly at her phrasing, clearly finding her conversational style odd. Indeed, we trust the accommodations will suit. London is, of course, far more refined than your colonies. His dismissiveness was polite, but cutting. Her American origins were clearly a mark against her. It was then that Curtis Donovan entered the room, trailing behind his brother like a delightful, unexpected afterthought. He was the right figure in her mind's eye, and the first thing Julianne noticed was the contrast. Where Reed's suit was rigid and his tie tight, Curtis wore his coat with a kind of easy elegance that hinted at a modern man chafing against historical formality. He was younger, his features slightly softer, but his gaze was instantly warmly engaging. He moved toward her with a confidence that felt less like aristocratic entitlement and more like genuine curiosity. Ah, the American mystery. Welcome, Miss Sterling, Curtis said. His voice lighter and imbued with an easygoing, almost mischievous charm. He took her hand properly this time, holding it a moment longer than necessary. Forgive my brother, Julianne. He only speaks in statutes and land deeds these days. I, on the other hand, am entirely at your disposal for matters of less consequence, such as avoiding stuffy balls and finding decent coffee. Julianne felt an immediate, involuntary softening in her chest. A lifeline, decent coffee, a joke about the future, a shared language that cut through the fog of lace and formality. Curtis! Reed's sharp reprimand cut through the air. Miss Sterling is a guest, not a confidant for your juvenile complaints. Curtis simply winked at Julianne, entirely unbothered. Apologies, brother. It seems my manners are also American-leaning. A terrible affliction. Julianne managed a genuine laugh this time. It is a relief, Mr. Curtis. I confess, I was worried I might commit 100 societal faux pas before dinner. The interaction was brief, but it sealed a fact in Julianne's mind. Reed was the mission. Curtis was the relief. The following days settled into a disconcerting pattern. Julianne, desperately trying to integrate herself into Reed's life to protect him, found herself constantly rebuffed or minimized. Reed was too busy, too dedicated to his political affairs, too formal to engage in the kind of casual conversation that would allow her to probe for information about his enemies. Her attempts to discuss his associates or the potential political climate were met with polite condescension. Miss Sterling, these matters are quite beyond the purview of a young woman's concern, he had stated stiffly one afternoon when she mentioned his recent visit to Parliament. You must occupy yourself with the domestic arts, perhaps. Lady Kensington is hosting a gathering of needleworkers next week. His dismissiveness stung, not just her pride, but her mission. How could she protect the man who wouldn't let her near him? The very thing she had romanticized about him, his noble, serious, dutiful nature, was the greatest barrier to her success. She had loved the idea of a self-sacrificing hero. She found the reality to be rigid and emotionally distant. Consequently, she spent increasing amounts of time with Curtis. Unlike Reed, Curtis had a vast curiosity about the world outside their aristocratic bubble. He was the one who sought her out in the library, eager to hear her, highly censored, stories about her American background. He was the one who encouraged her to ride his horse, Comet, a gesture Reed would have found scandalously improper. One rainy afternoon, they were secluded in the library, ostensibly cataloging some obscure French texts. "You are quite remarkable, Julianne," Curtis said, leaning back against a mahogany shelf, watching her. "You have no interest in the tedious small talk that occupies every other woman in this house. You seem to be looking through the walls, not at them." Julian stiffened. Had she been too obvious? "I only find history fascinating, Mr. Curtis, especially the political history of this period. Your brother is quite influential, is he not?" She tried, carefully redirecting the conversation back to the mission. Curtis sighed, the sound entirely modern. "Reed is everything a gentleman should be. Dutiful, revered, destined for greatness. He carries the weight of the family name, and he does it with severe, unrelenting grace. That sash he wears in formal affairs? It weighs 100 pounds, I swear. He is the hero of the age." "And you?" Julian asked, genuinely curious. She saw no melancholy in him, only a quiet resistance. Curtis pushed off the shelf and walked toward her, closing the distance quickly. "I am the charming rogue, the spare tire, the one who is expected to drink too much brandy and marry for amusement. Frankly, it's far easier. I don't have to carry the empire. I only have to entertain it." He paused, his expression shifting from playful to intense. "Until you arrived, I didn't realize how bored I was with the role. You, Julian, you feel like a breath of fresh air. You smell like the future." The comment was so close to the truth it made her skin prickle. "That's quite the observation, Mr. Curtis. It's just Curtis, please, and I observe you because you fascinate me. You're here to save my brother, aren't you?" he whispered, his voice low enough that it couldn't travel beyond their immediate space. Julianne's blood ran cold. "He knows. How does he know?" I don't know what you mean." Curtis smiled, a sad, knowing twist of his lips. "You look at him as if he's a statue about to fall. You hover with an intensity that is not attraction, but protection. Everyone else here sees a beautiful woman drawn to the powerful elder brother. I see a soldier on a desperate mission. Tell me, Julianne, what does Reed need saving from?" His perception was terrifying. Reed saw a woman interested in needlework. Curtis saw the frantic physicist. This immediate, deep intellectual intimacy, the ability to see her and not just the facade, was a kind of connection she hadn't anticipated and certainly hadn't planned for. It was intoxicating. She couldn't tell him the truth, but she realized she could use his connection to her advantage. "I have a terrible premonition, Curtis. I feel a danger around this family, and Reed, with his duties, is the most exposed." Curtis's expression sobered instantly. "A premonition? In your colonies? Do they believe in such things?" "They believe in what they see," she countered. "And I see too much risk." Over the next few days, their secret alliance solidified. Curtis, with his easy access to social circles and his knack for overhearing things his brother missed, became her intelligence network. Julian realized she was no longer just protecting Reed. She was enjoying the presence of Curtis, his witty remarks, his easy touch when guiding her through the estate, the way his eyes lit up when she explained a scientific concept, albeit disguised as a peculiar American theory. One afternoon, Curtis burst into the library where Julianne was trying to decipher Reed's cryptic political calendar. "There, the Society of the Golden Hand," Curtis exclaimed, pointing to an entry. "That's the radical group my father keeps arguing with. They hate Reed because he's the face of the old guard. They want change, violent, absolute change. Julian traced the date. October 27th. The Golden Hand. The pattern was forming. Reed was slated to make a speech at the Crown Assembly. The historical details were proving chillingly accurate. Thank you, Curtis. This is vital. I must find a way to stop him from going. Julian whispered, her focus intense. Curtis grabbed her hand, stopping her as she moved toward the door. The contact was electric, dissolving her concentration. Must you always be racing toward him, Julianne? She looked up, startled by the raw emotion in his eyes. He wasn't joking or charming now. He was wounded. He needs me, Curtis, she said, her voice strained by her duty. He needs duty. He needs validation. He needs the public to affirm his importance. Curtis countered fiercely. You came here for him to protect his future. But Julianne, what about yours? Do you feel alive when you are with Reed, talking about land deeds and political structure? Or do you feel alive when you're here, talking about the stars and what exists beyond the horizon? He had articulated the core of her internal crisis. Reed offered a noble, predictable future, the one she had been promised by history. Curtis offered an unpredictable, terrifying present, the one her heart was now demanding. The intensity of her mission was faltering, undermined by the fierce, spontaneous connection she shared with the younger brother. I crossed centuries for the idea of a man, and I fell for the reality of his shadow. She pulled her hand away, a deep, conflicted frown pulling her face taut. The same look she had worn at the ball in the previous chapter, reflecting her dilemma. I have a mission, Curtis. I can't fail. Too much depends on it. Curtis looked utterly defeated, yet his love for his brother prompted his next question, driven by the nobility he tried to hide. Then let me help you. 2 people guarding Reed are better than 1. And if we succeed in saving the man you love. He left the sentence unfinished, his eyes holding hers in a painful silence that spoke volumes about his own unspoken love. Julian knew she should stop him, that every moment spent with Curtis was a betrayal of her mission's purity, a risk to the timeline, and a danger to her own heart. But she needed him. His help was invaluable, and his company was the only thing making the 19th century bearable. All right, Curtis, she conceded, the decision marking a shift in her loyalty. Help me keep him alive. But you must promise me absolute secrecy. Curtis's face lit up, not with triumph, but with genuine relief that she hadn't pushed him away. You have my word. Now, tell me everything you know about the Crown Assembly, and why the Society of the Golden Hand chose October 27th. As they bent their heads together over the map of London, discussing exit strategies and security flaws. Reed's security flaws? His life. Julian felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. It was a connection born of shared risk and intellectual spark, a love that bypassed destiny and duty, solidifying her secret, terrible truth. She was here to save the hero, but she was falling for the rogue. The sense of urgency within Julian had become a low, persistent hum beneath the surface of her aristocratic facade. October 27th was less than 2 weeks away, and Reed Donovan remained an impenetrable fortress of duty, shielded by his schedule and his rigid notion of propriety. Her alliance with Curtis was the only thing giving her any traction, yet every shared glance, every conspiratorial whisper, was a wire pulled tighter around her own heart. The mission was becoming indistinguishable from the distraction. Julianne had returned to the only hard fact she possessed, the Donovan family portrait. The one she had spent hours studying in the future, the one that showed the family before the tragedy. Reed, front and center, wearing the elaborate crimson and gold sash of the Royal Order of St. Michael, signifying his political rank and the weight of his inherited power. Historically, he was killed while wearing that sash, giving a public address. The attack was political, targeting the symbol of the old guard. Her current goal was simple: find out what that sash represented, who hated what it stood for, and where Reed was scheduled to display it in the coming weeks. She broached the topic carefully one morning while Reed was preparing for an event. She found him in the great hall, adjusting the heavy velvet of the sash over his shoulder, the gold embroidery gleaming in the pale morning light. "Mr. Donovan," Julie and began, keeping her tone light, "that is quite the impressive garment. It looks ancient. What does it signify precisely?" Reed paused, his expression shifting from detached concentration to mild annoyance at her interruption. "It is the Grand Cordon of the Order of St. Michael, Miss Sterling. It signifies the king's faith in the family's loyalty and my position within the political establishment. It is hardly a garment. It is a symbol of responsibility." He emphasized the last word with cold finality, as if to remind her of the vast chasm between his world of duty and her world of, presumably, frivolous American interests. "And you wear it often?" she pressed. "Only on occasions of the utmost importance. Tonight, for the Earl of Harrington's memorial dinner. And next, the Crown Assembly on the 27th. Now, if you'll excuse me, I am running late." He gave her a perfunctory nod and was gone, leaving Julie staring at the empty doorway, her breath catching on the date. October 27th. The Crown Assembly. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with horrifying certainty. Later that afternoon, she tracked down Curtis in the billiard room, where he was pretending to practice, but was mostly just staring out the window. "The sash," she murmured, shutting the door behind her. "The Order of St. Michael. What do you know about its enemies?" Curtis pocketed a ball lazily. "Enemies? You mean everyone who doesn't have one. The order is the old establishment. Land, tradition, crown authority. Everyone who wants change, economic reform, suffrage, a republic, they hate the sash. It's like wearing a target." He grinned, but his eyes were serious. "You're talking about the Society of the Golden Hand, aren't you? I told you they were trouble. Tell me everything you know about them," Julian urged, pulling him toward a discreet corner of the room. "Names, grievances, locations. Anything that isn't public knowledge." Curtis shook his head. "I told you Reed operates in a bubble of treaties and trusts. I operate in a bubble of clubs and scandal. I don't know names, but I know where their shadows fall. Their main gripe isn't with the land. It's with the system that allows a few men in sashes to dictate the lives of millions." Julian rubbed her temples, frustrated. Future knowledge was a blunt tool. It gave her the what and the when, but not the fine-grained who and how. She needed specific intelligence. Curtis, sensing her rising anxiety, changed tactics. He leaned in, his voice taking on a thoughtful, almost academic tone that never failed to surprise her. "You're thinking too much like a general, Julianne. Reed is the face. The Golden Hand wouldn't try to assassinate him at his home. They need the symbolism of a public execution to ignite their cause. The Crown Assembly is perfect. But how would they get to him?" Julian frowned. "I only know they succeed. I know the result is a massive political upheaval." "Yes, but think about the order itself. It's supposed to be impenetrable. What's the weakness of the symbol?" Curtis walked to a portrait of his father, Lord Donovan, painted 20 years prior, also wearing the Grand Cordon. He tapped the thick gold chain accessory that secured the sash over the shoulder. "The key isn't the sash, it's the security. Who is in charge of protecting the symbols of the crown?" "The royal guards, presumably," Julian answered. "Exactly. But look at this," Curtis said, pointing to the backdrop of the painting, a detailed, though hazy, depiction of the entrance to the Crown Assembly. "It's impossible to get close to the center of the hall. No, if they're going to succeed, they have to exploit a known flaw. Something routine." His light-hearted speculation was proving more insightful than Reed's rigid secrecy. Julian suddenly remembered a minor historical footnote, a brief, unconfirmed report of a fire in the Assembly's East Wing a week before the assassination. She hadn't paid it any mind, dismissing it as unrelated construction damage. A recent repair, she whispered, connecting the dots. The east wing of the assembly. If there was recent damage or construction, the security protocols would be compromised. A new route for the honored guests, perhaps? Or a vulnerable entrance? Curtis's eyes widened, his earlier mischief replaced by a profound, shared understanding. A vulnerable entrance. The order members, the men in the sashes, are too important to use a compromised entrance. The assassin wouldn't risk being stopped by the guards outside. No, they would exploit the staff entrance or a service tunnel. And who would know the specifics of a recent repair job? Julian asked, her mind racing, adrenaline spiking with the certainty of the threat. Curtis looked down, his expression suddenly dark. Someone on the inside, Julianne. Someone who shouldn't be there, but who has access to the structural plans. They fell into a charged silence, the heavy atmosphere of the estate closing in on them. They were no longer discussing history or politics. They were discussing life and death, united by a secret that could destroy the Donovan family. I have to get the blueprints for the assembly, Julian determined. I need to see the flaw. Impossible, Curtis immediately countered. They're locked in my father's private study, secured with a lock that hasn't been changed since the Regency. Reed has the key. The mention of Reed brought the reality of her dilemma crashing back. She was relying on the brother she hadn't come for to save the brother she felt increasingly distant from. Curtis? She started, her voice softening, driven by a need to understand the source of his quiet resentment. Why are you helping me like this? You don't owe Reed anything, especially not his life. He treats you like an afterthought. Curtis turned away, picking up a cue stick, but didn't shoot. His voice was low, edged with years of suppressed emotion. We are brothers, Julianne. That is an inescapable fact. I resent the weight he carries, and I envy the reverence he receives. I envy the meaning of his life. Reed is the hero of our family, the anchor that holds the estate, the political powerhouse. Every decision he makes is deemed correct. Every path he takes is the right one. I am simply the charming distraction. He finally lined up a shot, hitting the white ball too hard. It scattered the others violently, a display of sudden, unrestrained force. I grew up watching him be perfect, Curtis continued, his back still to her. Watching my father lavish all his pride and attention on the one who carries the sash, the one destined for the order. Reed is loved by history, by duty, by the very establishment you are trying to protect. And I am simply here. If he dies, I become Reed. And I don't want that life. I don't want the sash. It's heavy, Julian, far too heavy. But he's still my brother. And you are the only person who has ever looked at me and seen something useful, something meaningful, beyond the charm. He turned back to her then, his vulnerability a stark contrast to his usual wit. The confession stripped away the last vestiges of the charming rogue, revealing a man burdened by invisibility. Julian felt an overwhelming wave of affection and profound sadness wash over her. This connection, born of shared secrecy and mutual understanding, was deeper and more terrifyingly real than the idealized devotion she had reserved for the historical Reed. She walked to Curtis not as a scientist plotting a mission, but as a woman responding to raw honesty. You are not an afterthought, Curtis, she said softly. You are the only person here who is seeing what is actually real, not what is merely proper. Your life has immense meaning, and you are not simply here. She met his eyes, allowing her feelings, her burgeoning, forbidden love, to show through her fear. You are the reason I haven't lost my way in this rigid, cold world. Curtis closed the final distance between them, his eyes searching hers, recognizing the sincerity in her confession. He didn't speak, but his hand lifted, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw, the touch a featherlight brush against her skin. You were meant to save him, Curtis whispered, his voice thick with emotion. But perhaps you were meant to save me, too. The moment hung, charged and desperate, an unacknowledged kiss suspended in the air. Julian knew she should pull back, remind herself of October 27th, remind herself of the paradox of time travel. Instead, she leaned into his touch, allowing herself a brief, dangerous moment of succumbing to the reality of the present. The mission, the sash, the assassination. All of it faded into a distant hum. The only certainty was the warmth of Curtis's hand on her face, and the devastating, beautiful realization that she had risked everything for a ghost, only to find true love in his living shadow. She knew then that she had to save Reed, not for history, but for Curtis, so that the younger brother would not be forced to wear a burden he despised. She had to save Reed to save Curtis's freedom, and to save the love she had found in the wrong century. The stakes had been raised, shifting from a historical necessity to a personal, agonizing choice. The quiet confession in the billiard room, Curtis's raw admission of his envy, and Julianne's reciprocal acknowledgement of his worth, left Julian reeling, throwing her mission into painful relief. She had been sent across time to secure a lineage, to prevent a tragedy that would scar her history. Yet, every minute spent with Curtis pulled her further away from that imperative and closer to a future she couldn't account for. With the date of the assassination, October 27th, rapidly approaching, she knew she had to perform a painful, necessary corrective. She had to sever, or at least severely limit, her attachment to Curtis and force herself back into the austere orbit of Reed Donovan. She spent the entirety of the next morning avoiding the library and the billiard room, and instead found a spot in the music room, a place she knew Curtis rarely frequented. She pored over Reed's publicly published speeches, trying to decipher a motive, a threat, anything that would give her leverage in warning him. His words were flawless, high-minded rhetoric about the stability of the crown, the sacredness of duty, and the preservation of order. He was a symbol so polished, so perfect, he was practically immune to flaw, and therefore an ideal target for those who sought chaos. Julian realized the only way to penetrate his reserve was to speak his language. Duty. She waited until late afternoon, knowing Reed would be in his private study before dinner, reviewing briefs. She took a deep, steadying breath, forced the image of Curtis's intense gaze from her mind, and marched toward the most restricted room in the house. She knocked precisely twice. A sharp, formal voice granted entry. Reed was seated behind a massive, leather-topped desk, flanked by towering stacks of documents. The candlelight caught the stern lines of his face, emphasizing the exhaustion etched around his eyes. He looked less like the noble hero and more like a man suffocating beneath the weight of expectations. "Miss Sterling," he said, not unkindly, but with a weary surprise. "I trust you are well occupied? I am afraid I have no time for social calls. Forgive my intrusion, Mr. Donovan, but this is not a social call," Julian said, stepping further into the room and closing the heavy door. She focused on the seriousness of her mission, letting the gravity seep into her voice. "I am deeply concerned about the political climate. The things I hear about the dissenters, the radicals, they speak with a conviction that suggests violence. I fear for your safety, sir." Reed looked at her fully then, his dark eyes narrowing slightly, assessing her sudden seriousness. "You concern yourself with matters that are truly none of your business, Julianne. My safety is secured by the guards and by the stability of the monarchy. Dissenters talk. They do not act. But what if they do act?" Julian pressed, moving closer to the desk. "What if they see you, the face of the Order of St. Michael, as a necessary sacrifice for their cause? You are the most visible symbol of what they despise." Reed rose slowly, walking to the large window that overlooked the darkening grounds. The candlelight threw his tall silhouette into sharp relief. He looked invincible, yet Julianne saw the flicker of strain. "You don't understand, Julianne," he said, his voice dropping slightly. losing the formal rigidity for the first time. The order, the sash, the duty, it is not merely an honor. It is a burden, a heavy one. My father, his father, they all carried this. They built this empire of order on the principle that someone must stand firm against chaos, that someone must be willing to sacrifice personal ambition for the good of the state. He turned back to her, and for a fleeting moment, Julian saw past the historical hero to the man. She saw the 20-something-year-old who had probably dreamed of something else. Adventure, perhaps, or a love untainted by obligation, before the weight of his name settled over him. It was a rare, poignant glimpse of the human cost of his heroism. "Do you think I enjoy every aspect of this life?" Reed asked, his gaze intense. "The endless politicking, the formal restrictions, the inability to simply be? No, but I accept it, because someone has to be the anchor. If I shirk my duty, if I prioritize safety or, God forbid, personal happiness, the entire system crumbles. My safety is secondary to my purpose." Julianne's heart ached for him. She felt a profound return of the idealized love she had for him. The pure, altruistic devotion to a man who sacrificed himself for a greater good. This was the hero she had crossed time for. "But if you are gone, Mr. Donovan," she argued, her voice softening with genuine sympathy, "the order is compromised anyway. Your purpose is negated. Surely, protecting your life is the highest form of duty." He offered a curt, sad smile. "You are an idealist, Julianne, a beautiful idealist, and I appreciate your concern. But I assure you, I have taken every proper precaution, and I cannot let fear dictate my actions. I will be at the Crown Assembly on the 27th. I will wear the sash, and I will deliver the address." His voice had returned to its customary firmness, the moment of vulnerability passing like a shadow. He had drawn his emotional armor back around him. The conversation had been frustratingly circular, yet profoundly illuminating. Julianne left the study feeling a sharp, agonizing conflict. She loved the idea of Reed, the noble, self-sacrificing core she had glimpsed beneath his formalism. She was desperate to save that man. But the reality of Reed, distant, dismissive, incapable of intimacy, trapped by his own rigidity, contrasted sharply with the easy, immediate comfort she found in Curtis. She wandered aimlessly through the drafty corridors, the contrast between the brothers becoming a physical ache. Reed was duty, cold, heavy, and correct. Curtis was desire, light, warm, and dangerous. Later that evening, she watched the two brothers at dinner. Reed presided at the head of the table, discussing tariffs with their father, his expression stern and focused. Curtis, seated opposite her, caught her eye. He made a subtle, mocking grimace at the mention of the Corn Laws, and then winked, immediately establishing a private, shared world that excluded everyone else at the table. That wink was a lifeline. It pulled her out of the cold correctness of Reed's orbit and reminded her that escape was possible. After dinner, as the family retired to the sitting room, Julianne found herself positioned awkwardly near the fireplace, still grappling with Reed's immovable conviction. Curtis approached her, holding a glass of port. "You spoke to him," Curtis stated, without preamble. "I did," Julianne admitted, lowering her voice. "He will not budge. He calls his rigidity duty, and he considers his life secondary to the symbol he represents. He is committed to wearing the sash at the assembly." Curtis took a slow sip of the port, his gaze distant. "I told you, the sash is a burden, and Reed is determined to bear it. He always has been." "And you envy that?" she asked, genuinely curious after their earlier conversation. Curtis shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. "I envy the clarity, Julianne. He has a clear path and a clear purpose, however heavy. His life is mathematically precise. Mine is chaotic. I envy that he can look at the future and know exactly where his feet should fall. I only know where mine would like to run." He let his eyes drift pointedly toward the door, suggesting escape. The temptation was overwhelming. Reed's path, the mathematically precise future Julianne was meant to secure, was built on cold, distant devotion. Curtis's path, the chaotic one, was built on shared glances, laughter, and intellectual connection. Julianne suddenly felt a sharp, profound conflict. She had risked everything for a devotion she believed was her destiny, but she found true love in a spontaneous connection. The original love, Reed, was cold, distant, and impossible to save because of his own principles. The new love, Curtis, was warm, understanding, and actively seeking partnership. The dichotomy was agonizing. If she succeeded in saving Reed, she secured her future lineage, but she would likely remain forever separated from the man her heart now demanded. If she failed or chose to prioritize Curtis, the future she knew would be erased, a terrifying, irreversible temporal risk. "I have to get the blueprints, Curtis," Julianne said urgently, clinging to the mission like a drowning woman clinging to a spar. "If Reed is set on going to the assembly, we need to know the vulnerability, the east wing, the service entrance. We need those structural plans from your father's study." Curtis sighed, recognizing that she was using the mission as a shield against their growing feelings. "The study is impossible, Julianne. Reed keeps the key beneath his pillow. He is meticulous about security, precisely because of his duty." "Then we must be meticulously deceptive," Julianne countered, her physicist mind taking over, relishing the challenge of problem-solving over emotional confusion. "If Reed's greatest strength is his predictable routine, then that is his greatest weakness. We must exploit the rhythm of his duty." Curtis's eyes brightened, catching the spark of adventure that always seemed to draw him to her. A break-in into the most secure room in the house, under the very nose of the most dutiful man in the country? Now that sounds like a worthwhile task. A noble quest, even if the only prize is a sheaf of dusty papers. His light-hearted willingness to risk everything for her mission, without judgment or demand, only deepened Julianne's affection. She was forcing herself toward Reed, the noble hero, but Curtis, the charming rogue, was the only one who truly had her back. The profound conflict was no longer a question of who to save, but who to choose. She resolved then that she would save Reed for his life, but she would choose Curtis for her own. They finalized their plan in quick, hushed whispers, an audacious, dangerous scheme that relied entirely on Reed's adherence to his nightly regimen. Julianne would create a brief, necessary distraction that would pull Reed away from his quarters, allowing Curtis the precious 2 minutes he needed to retrieve the key and copy the blueprints. The stakes were monumental, but looking into Curtis's excited, conspiratorial eyes, Julianne felt a thrill that transcended the fear of temporal paradoxes. She was living fully, dangerously, in a way she never had in the sterile clarity of the future. She was choosing the complexity of the present over the certainty of the past. The invitation arrived with a flourish of gilt edges and a promise of a night that would define the London season. The Duke and Duchess of Bedford were hosting a grand charity ball, and it was the perfect stage for the Donovan family to reaffirm their political and social stature. For Julianne, it was the perfect chance to execute the first phase of her plan to save Reed, and, simultaneously, a terrifying environment where the weight of her choice would be amplified 100-fold by the relentless scrutiny of high society. She had spent the last 2 days carefully crafting her distraction, a seemingly innocent act that would necessitate Reed leaving the room at a very precise time later that night. But tonight, she was forced to participate in the grand facade. She descended the main staircase of the Donovan estate dressed in a gown that had caused the staff to whisper. A rich, deep velvet, a color she knew was rare in this era. It clung to her figure with a modern simplicity that stood out against the prevailing preference for excessive frills and lace. It was her armor, a subtle defiance of the rigid norms she had traveled back in time to uphold. Her appearance, she knew, was a deliberate disruption, designed to draw eyes and, most importantly, to draw the attention of the two men who now dominated her existence. In the foyer, Reed was waiting. He looked every inch the noble hero of history, commanding, severe, wearing a new, meticulously pressed formal coat. His gaze, however, was critically focused on her dress. "Miss Sterling," he said, his voice measured, "your attire is striking, perhaps a touch unconventional for the Duchess's ball. But I trust it will serve to remind society of your unique American spirit." His compliment was laced with a paternal, almost dismissive judgment. He saw her as an exotic, temporary diversion, nothing more. "I am simply dressed for the pleasure of the dance, Mr. Donovan," Julian replied, offering a cool, polite smile that masked her deep frustration. Her duty lay with him, but her spirit chafed at his rigid control. Curtis, emerging from the shadows near the entrance, offered a far different appraisal. He was dressed flawlessly, yet wore his clothes with a spontaneous ease. He stopped and simply looked at her, his lips curving into a slow, appreciative smile that reached his light, expressive eyes. "It is perfection, Julianne," Curtis murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "It is entirely you. The future looks stunning." He offered his arm with a casual grace that Reed never allowed himself. "Shall we conquer London?" The contrast was immediate and agonizing. Reed claimed her presence. Curtis validated herself. The ball itself was a sensory explosion. Crystal chandeliers raining light onto a sea of shimmering silks, the constant, murmuring roar of hundreds of conversations, and the insistent, sweeping rhythm of the orchestra. Julianne was instantly the center of attention. Her unusual dress, her confident bearing, and the mystery of her American background ensured that. As the first waltz began, Reed was there. He claimed her hand with the precision of a man filing a legal document. "This dance is an obligation, Miss Sterling," he informed her, pulling her onto the floor. "I must ensure our guests understand the importance of the Donovan name. You will remain close to me." The dance was predictably formal and flawless. Reed was an impeccable dancer, guiding her through the intricate steps with powerful, practiced control. Yet, their conversation was entirely impersonal. He spoke of the importance of the Anglo-American trade agreements, the latest political posturing in Parliament, and the enduring quality of the crown. "You speak of duty as if it were the only currency of life, Mr. Donovan," Julian risked, leaning slightly closer. Reed's jaw tightened marginally. "It is the only currency that lasts, Miss Sterling. Passion fades. Sentiment is fleeting. Only duty provides the stability that makes a civilized life possible. Everything I do, everything I am, is in service of that principle." He was untouchable. He was the hero of her history, the man who sacrificed his heart for his name. She felt a surge of respect, the original devotion she'd carried across time, but it was cold. It was the love one feels for an historical monument. Revered, necessary, but utterly distant. As she looked at his handsome, severe face, she felt the internal panic rising. "This is my destiny. This is the man I risked everything for. Why do I feel nothing but duty?" They executed a final, sweeping turn, and Reed returned her to the side, his duty fulfilled. "Thank you, Miss Sterling. Now, you may engage in conversation with the more suitable young ladies. I must speak with the Earl of Harrington about his military contacts." And just like that, he was gone, absorbed back into the serious, rigid world that Julian found suffocating. She endured the next hour in a haze of small talk and political posturing, her mind constantly ticking through her plan. The distraction was set for midnight. She needed to focus on the assembly and the blueprint, but her eyes kept searching the crowd. She found Curtis leaning against a marble column, watching her with an unervingly clear intensity. He wore a smile, but it was the knowing, intimate smile of a co-conspirator. The orchestra began to play the final, sweeping waltz of the evening, a melody that seemed designed to pull secrets from the shadows. Before anyone else could approach, Curtis was by her side. "May I steal the final dance, Julianne?" he asked, his voice a low, insistent invitation. "You may steal anything you wish, Curtis," she replied, allowing a reckless abandon to enter her tone. This dance was the opposite of Reed's. Where Reed was control, Curtis was spontaneity. He didn't guide her with powerful, precise motions. He moved with a fluid, captivating grace, his hand resting lightly but firmly on her waist. He pulled her close enough that she could inhale the faint, clean scent of his skin and the subtle aroma of good brandy. A sensory memory that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with desire. "You look absolutely miserable when you are standing still," Curtis whispered, leaning down so his lips were dangerously close to her ear. "The minute you start moving, however, you look like a woman who finally remembered she is allowed to breathe." "I have duties, Curtis," she deflected, using Reed's language, though it felt hollow on her tongue. "I know," he murmured, his gaze holding hers. "You have the duty to protect my brother, and the duty to maintain your cover. But you are forgetting the duty to Julian Sterling." "And what is that?" "To live in the present," he said simply. "You came from the future to save the man of your destiny. But if destiny makes you look that frantic, perhaps it's a poor choice. Perhaps destiny is merely a story you were told, not one you actually wrote." The music swelled, pulling them closer in the crowded room. Julian felt an electrifying awareness of him, his strength, his easy passion, the depth of his understanding. He saw the scientist trapped in the velvet dress. Reed only saw the eccentric American cousin. "And what do you offer, Curtis?" Julian challenged, her voice strained. "The present," he replied, spinning her in a breathtaking turn before pulling her back to him, his eyes shining with open, exhilarating affection. "I offer the right now. I offer the laughter, the risk, the truth. I offer a love that doesn't demand sacrifice, only honesty." She looked past his shoulder, catching a glimpse of Reed standing by the punch bowl, his back straight, his profile engaged in a serious conversation with a government official. Reed, the flawless marble monument, the embodiment of her lineage. She looked back at Curtis, the flawed, wonderful, living man holding her, and realized the full extent of her internal chaos. "Reed is my destiny. Curtis is my desire." The expression Julian wore was the exact internal panic captured in the historical image she'd studied. The conflicting light in her eyes, the slight, terrified strain around her mouth. She was standing between two centuries, between two loves, forced into a choice that would either secure her future or shatter it for a chance at true happiness. The music ended with a dramatic final chord. Curtis kept his hand on hers for a long, aching moment, his touch a silent question. Julian pulled her hand away, fueled by a sudden, frantic need to restore order to her world. "It is late, Curtis. We have work to do. We still need those blueprints." She used the mission to create the necessary distance, forcing her focus back onto the external threat. Curtis understood immediately. His expression shifted back to that of the co-conspirator, but a thread of disappointment remained. "As you wish. Duty calls. Meet me near the staff entrance in 20 minutes. Don't be late, or Reed will demand a full accounting of your whereabouts." She watched him walk away, and the grand, glittering room suddenly felt cold again. The dance had not only confirmed her feelings for Curtis, it had finalized the painful emotional separation from Reed. Her task was no longer to fall in love with the hero. It was to save him so she could be free to choose his brother. The mission was now personal, driven not by the past, but by the desperate hope for her own future. The blueprints and the break-in were the only way forward. The theft of the blueprints from Lord Donovan's secured study had been executed with flawless, agonizing tension. Julianne, feigning a sudden, debilitating migraine just as Reed was preparing for his nightly review of parliamentary papers, had ensured he was preoccupied with summoning a maid and securing a tincture. Curtis, moving with the silence and speed of a professional thief, had snatched the key from beneath Reed's pillow, unlocked the study, and copied the necessary sections onto tissue-thin paper, all in under 120 seconds. The risk had been breathtaking, the adrenaline leaving Julie and physically shaking afterward, but they had succeeded. Now, hunched over the fragile drawings in a quiet corner of the conservatory, the only room with enough ventilation to dissipate the smell of the acidic pen they used for tracing, Julianne's scientific training took over. The structural plans for the Crown Assembly were complex, but the recent construction anomaly, marked by hastily redrawn lines, was immediately obvious. "There," Julian whispered, her finger tracing a section of the east wing marked for temporary repairs, drainage and scaffolding access. "This is the flaw. The main entry is secure, but the service entrance to the east wing leads directly to a staff hallway that feeds into the main dais where Reed will be giving his address." Curtis, leaning close enough for his breath to stir the strands of hair near her ear, pointed to a nearby chamber. "The cloakroom. It backs onto that hallway. Anyone posing as a lower-level functionary could gain access to this repair section. If the Golden Hand is organized enough to get a man inside, this is where they'll strike. It's too routine for the Royal Guard to check thoroughly." Julian felt a wave of chilling certainty. This wasn't a historical footnote anymore. It was a tactical reality. They aren't just looking for an opportunity, Curtis. They are exploiting a known temporary vulnerability. This plot is sophisticated. They didn't just target Reed. They targeted the flaw in the building's design. She spent the next few hours comparing the blueprint details to her knowledge of the historical context, sifting through the reports Curtis had gathered on the Society of the Golden Hand. She looked for the who, the structural engineer, the key political rival, the radical whose words were most fiery. It was a seemingly insignificant detail in a handwritten ledger, retrieved by Curtis from his father's discarded waste bin, that made Julianne's heart stop. The ledger detailed recent estate expenses, and nestled among them was a payment to a consulting firm for a property boundary dispute, the exact kind of dispute Reed was known to handle. The firm's name was Blackwood and Sons. Julianne recognized the name instantly, a cold knot forming in her stomach. Blackwood was not a radical name, but a rival establishment figure from her future history. He was the man who inherited Reed's political influence after the assassination, a figure who had been quietly manipulating events behind the scenes. History had painted the event as a spontaneous radical act, but the true puppet master was likely a rival seeking political gain. The plot is not just assassination. It's a political coup. The Golden Hand is merely the blade. "Curtis?" Julian gasped, the fragility of the paper in her hand suddenly feeling monumental. "The scope is wrong. It's not just a few radicals. It's political elimination. It's Blackwood. He benefits the most from Reed's death. He has the influence to compromise the Assembly's repairs, and he has the means to make the assassination look like an act of terrorism." Curtis looked skeptical. "Blackwood? He's a sniveling opportunist, yes, but he's not a killer. He's too afraid of his own shadow. He doesn't have to be the killer. He has to be the financier," Julian corrected, her mind racing, connecting the dots of 2 centuries of historical detail. "Blackwood is the mastermind. The Golden Hand is his disposable weapon. This means the danger is much, much closer than we thought. Reed is being hunted by his peers, not just by protesters." The weight of this realization was staggering. She had to warn Reed immediately, but he was attending a mandatory political dinner across town, immersed in the very world that was plotting his downfall. Driven by a terrible, cold certainty, Julianne gathered her papers and threw on her cloak. She had to find Reed before he returned and settled for the night. She hurried out of the conservatory and into the shadowed back hallways of the estate, intending to leave a coded, urgent message with a trusted footman. But as she rounded the corner near the back entrance, she nearly collided with Curtis, who was returning from a late-night ride, his riding crop in his hand, his hair slightly damp from the evening air. "Julianne, what are you doing? You look like you've seen a ghost," he exclaimed, immediately sensing her distress. "Worse than a ghost, Curtis. I've seen the future." The words slipped out, raw and panicked, before Julianne could retrieve them. The shock of the realization, the cold clarity of Blackwood's motive, had shattered her carefully maintained facade. Curtis's expression went from concern to sharp, focused alarm. "What did you say? The future? What are you talking about?" He grabbed her arms gently, pulling her into the deep shadows of an alcove beneath the main stairs. Julianne was trembling. She had been so committed to keeping her true identity and her time travel secret from everyone, including Curtis. But now, faced with a mastermind who was too powerful to combat conventionally, and an immediate need for absolute trust, her carefully constructed wall collapsed. The desperation to save Reed, and by extension, save Curtis from the burden of the sash, eclipsed all caution. "I need you to listen to me, and you cannot react," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, desperate whisper. "I am not merely an American cousin. I am from the future, the 21st century. I traveled here because Reed's assassination is a pivotal point in my history, a tragedy that allowed men like Blackwood to rise and destabilize the country for 100 years. Curtis didn't recoil. He simply stared at her, his eyes wide and unblinking, processing the impossible truth with a scientific curiosity that was entirely him. "The time machine," he breathed, a genuine wonder in his tone, completely accepting the insane premise. "That's why you knew the assassination date. That's why you knew the name of the order and the date of the assembly." Julianne nodded, tears of raw terror and relief stinging her eyes. She hadn't been rejected. She had been understood. The man who truly organized this is Blackwood. He needs Reed out of the way to seize power. And the East Wing flaw in the assembly, that's how they're getting in. This is why I needed the blueprints. "Blackwood," Curtis repeated, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. He finally understood the severity of the threat. It wasn't just a physical attack, but a calculated, deeply embedded conspiracy. "But Julianne," Curtis whispered, his eyes filled with a new, terrifying comprehension, "if you're from the future, and Reed's death is necessary for your history, what happens to your timeline if you save him? You could erase everything you know." The question was the temporal paradox she had avoided confronting since her arrival. It was the question of destiny versus free will. Julianne didn't hesitate with her answer, the truth spilling out, fueled by her desperate love for him. "I don't care about the historical timeline anymore. I came here to save the hero, but I found the man I need. If I save Reed, I save you from having to wear his burden. I save you from becoming the man you hate being forced to be. I am not choosing the past, Curtis. I am choosing the present. I am choosing us." The confession that her loyalty had irreversibly shifted, that she was willing to gamble the timeline for him, hung heavy and shimmering in the air between them. It was the most crucial secret she had revealed. Not just where she came from, but who she loved. Curtis's breath hitched. His fingers tightened on her arms, pulling her flush against him in the shadows. His face was a mask of disbelief and agonizing hope. "You risked everything, centuries, history, your entire world. For me?" he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I risked it for my own happiness," Julianne confessed, the weight of the lie finally lifting. "Reed is duty. You are life. We have to save Reed, Curtis, but now we save him so we can be together, not for some cold, distant future." The urgency of their danger was forgotten for a single, powerful second as Curtis pressed his lips urgently to hers. The kiss was desperate, relieved, and entirely fueled by the shared, life-or-death secret that bound them together. It sealed the revelation and the alliance, a physical covenant made beneath the watchful silence of the old house. Julianne finally pulled back, her eyes shining with fierce resolve. "We have to act now, Curtis. Blackwood is moving. We need a way to stop Reed from going to the assembly without revealing the entire truth, or Blackwood will simply try again." Curtis, his mind instantly snapping back to the mission, nodded sharply. The man who had been the charming rogue was now a determined co-conspirator, armed with impossible knowledge and driven by a desperate, new love. "We can't rely on premonitions or vague threats anymore," Curtis stated, his voice now firm. "We need tangible evidence. Blackwood won't be in the East Wing, but his assassin will. We need to find the assassin before he gets to the assembly and turn him against his employer. We need a way to disrupt Blackwood's plan so thoroughly that Reed is safe and Blackwood is exposed." Julianne felt a profound sense of relief. She was no longer fighting alone, or for a man who didn't see her. She was fighting alongside the man who saw her completely, paradox and all. The plot had thickened, becoming far more dangerous and politically complex, but their bond had thickened too, making them a formidable, if reckless, force. The next step was clear: find Blackwood's hired blade and destroy his conspiracy from the inside out. The following morning, the fragile, reckless joy of their shared secret and the desperate kiss in the shadows was brutally shattered. Julianne and Curtis had spent the pre-dawn hours meticulously dissecting the Blackwood plot, identifying possible contacts and safe houses based on Curtis's intimate, if frivolous, knowledge of London's underworld. The exhaustion and the heightened emotional state left them both dangerously vulnerable. It was an inevitability, given the rigid structure of the Donovan household and Reed's meticulous surveillance of every detail within it, that their secret alliance would not remain hidden for long. The confrontation came with the cold, unforgiving light of the new day. Julianne was retrieving a book on 19th-century political agitators from the library, a necessary bit of research for their next move, when she heard the library doors close with a sharp, controlled finality behind her. She turned to find Reed standing there, his face a mask of disappointment and rigid fury. He didn't shout. His anger was cold, measured, and far more terrifying than any outburst. "I will require an explanation, Miss Sterling," Reed stated, his voice devoid of his customary aristocratic politeness. A full explanation, and immediately. Julianne felt the blood drain from her face. She knew instantly that he hadn't merely seen them talking. He had witnessed something far more compromising. "I don't know what you are referring to, Mr. Donovan," she managed, clutching the book like a shield. Reed walked toward her, slowly, deliberately, stopping just short of her personal space. "I am referring to the fact that my younger brother was seen leaving your quarters, or rather the hallway leading to your quarters, at an indecent hour this morning. And I am referring to the fact that I overheard fragments of a conversation in the study last night, a conversation regarding structural flaws and temporal risks, before you both abruptly fell silent and retreated to the shadows of the garden." His control was absolute, but the tension in his shoulders and the piercing quality of his gaze showed his profound sense of betrayal. The foundation of his world, order, propriety, and duty, was being undermined by the two people closest to him. "You have compromised your reputation, Miss Sterling, and potentially my brother's, with your reckless, American habits," Reed continued, his voice tight. "But more gravely, you are interfering with matters that are far beyond your scope. My father placed you under my protection, and I demand to know why you are engaged in secret discussions with Curtis about matters of state security. What game are you playing?" Julianne had anticipated a reaction of cold dismissal, but not this level of profound, wounded ownership. He was viewing her not as a woman, but as a disruptive element threatening his entire system. She realized this was the moment of choice, the point of no return. She could lie, feign innocence, and retreat into the expected role of the protected, simple-minded female guest, thereby preserving her cover but losing all hope of saving him. Or, she could tell him the one truth that mattered, the danger, and gamble that his sense of duty would outweigh his pride. I am playing a game for your life, Mr. Donovan, Julian said, meeting his gaze with the full force of her terror and conviction. And the life of everyone in this house. The danger is real, it is immediate, and it is far more insidious than you can imagine. I have been attempting to warn you, but you refuse to listen, dismissing me as frivolous. Reed scoffed, crossing his arms. Vagueness will not suffice. Tell me exactly what you know. I know that the plot against you is not just a radical threat. It is orchestrated by a powerful political rival, Blackwood. I know that he intends to use the Crown Assembly on the 27th as the stage for your assassination, exploiting a structural flaw in the East Wing. Julian revealed, pouring out the most essential, actionable truth. She spoke rapidly, her voice low and frantic. I know this because I have done the work you refused to do, finding the blueprints and connecting the dots. Curtis helped me because he is the only person here who takes the threat seriously. Reed's stern facade cracked, but only slightly. The information was too specific, too accurate to dismiss as mere hysteria. He looked at her, truly seeing the desperation in her eyes for the first time. Blackwood? He repeated, the name laced with distaste. That opportunist?
Impossible.
And how could you possibly have accessed the blueprints? Because your duty blinds you, Reed, she exclaimed, dropping the formality in her distress. You are so committed to the idea of the proper threat that you refuse to see the one hiding in plain sight. I risked my cover and my reputation to get this information, and I will not allow you to walk into a fatal trap. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, the library door opened again, and Curtis walked in. He stopped dead, instantly absorbing the icy atmosphere and the furious set of his brother's shoulders. Reed, Curtis said, his voice calm, stepping protectively towards Julian. Leave her be. This is my doing. Reed rounded on his brother, his eyes flashing with the deep, visceral anger born of family shame. Your doing? You jeopardize her reputation. You violate father's study, and you conspire against my professional life with baseless premonitions. I demand to know why, Curtis. Why this sudden, reckless obsession? This was the moment of ultimate choice. Julian had to choose who to trust with the deeper truth, the emotional one, that governed her entire presence in the past. Reed wanted an explanation rooted in duty and politics. Curtis already knew the paradox. Julian stepped forward, positioning herself between the two brothers. She addressed Reed first, giving him the respect due to his position and her mission. Mr. Donovan, the secrets I have shared with you today, the details about Blackwood and the East Wing, are the absolute truth about the danger you face. I have told you this because I risked everything to save your life and secure your place in history. My actions with your brother were driven by the necessity of duty to prevent your death. She paused, allowing that truth to sink in. She had given him the mission, the rationale he craved. Then, she turned, her entire posture shifting, and addressed Curtis, her voice softening, stripping away the formality and the political urgency, leaving only raw, honest emotion. But Curtis, she said, her eyes locked solely on him, ignoring the furious man behind her. You asked me yesterday why I was racing toward my past, instead of embracing my present. And the truth is, my heart is no longer mine to give to the past. It belongs to the truth I found here. The silence in the library was absolute, broken only by the distant chime of the grandfather clock. Julian had drawn the line. Reed received the truth of the danger, the duty, but Curtis received the truth of her heart, the desire. Reed stood stunned, the air knocked out of his fury. His expression shifted from righteous anger to profound, bewildered hurt. He understood the meaning of her statement instantly. Her duty to him was a cold necessity, but her passion, her life, was centered on his younger brother. Curtis, however, looked overwhelmed by the sheer force and public nature of her confession. A wave of tenderness and fierce possessiveness washed over his features. The danger they faced was real, but the validation of their love was monumental. Reed, finally finding his voice, spoke, his tone heavy with resignation. This changes everything. Not because of my professional life, but because of the bond between my family and yours, Julianne. If you are here for a greater purpose, to save me, I must accept your knowledge, however unorthodox. But I will not allow this distraction with my brother to jeopardize the house further. It's not a distraction, Reed, Curtis countered, stepping up beside Julianne, his hand resting on the small of her back, a clear sign of ownership. It's the truth. Julianne and we are bound by something you cannot understand. And if you intend to move against Blackwood, you need her knowledge and you need my access. Reed stared at them, two defiant figures standing against his perfect, organized world. He saw the genuine devotion in Julianne's eyes and the fierce loyalty in Curtis's stance. He realized that to reject their warning was to walk straight into the arms of the assassin. To accept it meant destroying the stability of his own household and accepting the unbearable reality that his duty had cost him the woman he should have had, the woman who had risked centuries for him, only to choose his younger brother. With a final, deeply painful sigh, Reed nodded. The fight had left him. Very well. I accept your warning about Blackwood and the assembly. I will not dismiss it as hysteria. But from this moment forward, Julianne, you will restrict your movements to the public rooms and you will not be alone with my brother. We will use the information, but we will maintain the proper facade. The outside world must believe that my duty remains untouched. Now, tell me the exact location of this structural flaw. Julian knew the restriction was a hollow victory for Reed, an attempt to salvage a shred of propriety, but it was a vital concession. She had gained his belief in the danger, the critical element needed to survive October 27th. She nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the moment. She had sacrificed the ideal of her true love, but she had secured his attention and, more importantly, confirmed her love for Curtis. The stage was set. The final confrontation was days away, and they now moved as a fractured, compromised unit, bound by the necessity of saving one brother while choosing the other. The fate of her future, and the present of the two men, now hinged entirely on their ability to expose Blackwood without exposing Julianne's secret to the world. The air in the Crown Assembly Hall on the evening of October 27th was thick and humid, heavy with the collective expectation of political theater. Julianne stood rigid near the back of the main floor, the velvet of her conservative gown feeling like lead. Every sense was heightened, every peripheral movement a potential threat. Reed, stiff and formidable, was already positioned on the dais at the front of the hall, the grand cordon of the Order of St. Michael cutting a severe line of crimson and gold across his chest. He was a perfect, unmoving target, the very symbol of the stability Blackwood and the Golden Hand sought to dismantle. Julian searched the faces in the crowd, trying to spot the invisible menace. She knew the assassination was scheduled to occur during the peak of Reed's address, at the exact moment he invoked the sacred duty of the crown. She and Curtis had meticulously reviewed the blueprints, confirming that the vulnerable East Wing service entrance led directly to a concealed door behind the dais. But knowing the how did not mitigate the terrifying when. Curtis was nowhere near his brother. Following Julianne's urgent plan, he had positioned himself discreetly near the East Wing corridor, pretending to be waiting for an important dispatch. He was wearing his more modern-leaning suit, a subtle contrast to the sea of severe formal attire, a man designed to move quickly and unnoticed. He was Julianne's eyes and ears on the ground, the crucial element of their defense. The last time they had spoken, a tense moment near the cloakroom minutes ago, his hand had briefly pressed hers, a silent, powerful promise of mutual survival. Reed began his address, his voice clear, resonant, and utterly committed to his duty. The audience listened with respectful, if slightly bored, attention. Julian glanced at the clock. 8:47 p.m. They had mere minutes. She felt the cold panic creeping up her throat, the fear of failing the mission she had sacrificed her life for. She risked a quick look towards the east wing. Nothing. The area remained deceptively still. Reed reached the pivotal point of his speech, his cadence rising as he declared, "For the stability of this great nation rests not on fleeting sentiments, but on the sacred duty that binds the crown and its people." Now, Julianne's eyes darted toward the hidden service door behind the dais. The heavy velvet curtain shifted almost imperceptibly. A flicker of movement. The sight was instantaneous, but her physicist's mind processed the geometry instantly. A man emerging from the shadows, blending with the darkness of the stage, his hand moving to the inside of his coat. It wasn't a gun. It was something thin, silver, and designed to kill cleanly. At the exact same moment, Julian heard a muffled crash from the opposite direction, the east wing corridor where Curtis was stationed. It sounded like an overturned stack of metal, sharp and loud. It was a distraction, meant to draw the attention of the royal guards, leaving the assassin's approach clear. The assassin made his move, lunging toward Reed. The guards on the main floor were frozen, their eyes still sweeping the crowd for an obvious threat, completely missing the threat from behind the curtain. Julianne had only a split second. She had two targets, two men she loved, both in imminent danger. Reed was on the dais, the primary target, the noble figure of her destiny, the man she had to save to secure her family's future. Curtis was in the corridor, the one who had created the necessary distraction, now exposed and vulnerable, the man of her immediate, undeniable desire. Her mission demanded she secure Reed, the figure in the formal sash. Her heart rebelled violently. In that fraction of a second, fueled by pure, unthinking instinct, Julian acted. She didn't rush the dais. She didn't move toward the figure in the order's crimson and gold. Instead, she screamed. A sharp, piercing sound that cut through Reed's rhetoric and the music of the impending chaos. "Curtis! Get down!" The scream was not a warning to the assassin. It was a desperate cry of protection for the man she was terrified of losing. Her cry had a cascade effect. Reed, startled by the unexpected sound of his American guest screaming his brother's name, momentarily turned his head toward the sound. That minuscule fraction of a second was enough. The assassin, jarred by the unexpected disruption, missed his primary mark. The silver object, a finely weighted garrote or wire, glanced off Reed's shoulder sash instead of finding his neck. Reed cried out, clutching his shoulder, the heavy sash tearing slightly, the gold chain scattering small pieces of metal onto the dais floor. The main threat was mitigated, but chaos erupted. Meanwhile, Curtis, hearing Julianne's desperate shriek of his name and the ensuing crash, reacted immediately. He dropped flat to the floor of the east wing corridor, narrowly missing the heavy scaffolding pole that had been triggered to fall as part of the carefully timed accident. The distraction had become a secondary trap, designed by Blackwood to eliminate the perceptive younger brother should he interfere. The sound of her voice had literally saved his life. The main hall dissolved into pandemonium. Guards finally reacted, rushing the dais and apprehending the assassin, who was struggling violently. Julianne, ignoring the frightened cries of the ladies and the shouts of the gentlemen, pushed through the panicked crowd. Her gaze swept over the scene. Reed was alive, clutching his shoulder, his perfect facade shattered by pain and shock. But Julianne didn't stop at the dais. Her feet carried her, without a conscious decision, directly toward the east wing corridor. She found Curtis struggling to untangle himself from the fallen scaffolding, a shallow cut bleeding near his temple where he'd struck the stone floor. He was safe but vulnerable. Julianne dropped to her knees beside him, her entire focus on his breathing, his injuries. She pulled off her gloves and pressed the velvet of her own dress against his wound, her hands shaking. "Curtis, are you hurt? Talk to me. Are you stable?" Her voice was ragged, raw with the relief of seeing him alive. Curtis looked up at her, the fear slowly fading from his eyes, replaced by a profound, heart-stopping realization. "Your voice," he whispered, his hand instinctively reaching up to clutch her wrist. "You yelled my name, Julianne, not Reed's. You screamed for me." In that moment of raw, unplanned action, the truth of her heart was violently exposed. She had traveled across time for the man in the sash, the noble duty, the security of her future. But when faced with the primal choice between the two men, her purest instinct, her truest love, had chosen the more exposed modern suit. Reed, having been escorted from the dais and momentarily tended to by the royal physician, now stood at the mouth of the corridor, his face pale, his shoulder bleeding. He watched the scene, his intended savior kneeling, tears in her eyes, obsessively checking his younger brother for injury, completely ignoring his own wound. The revelation was unavoidable. Julianne, the woman who had claimed duty, who had claimed premonitions of danger around the elder brother, had sacrificed the precision of the mission for the survival of the younger. Curtis looked past Julianne's shoulder and saw Reed standing there. He lifted Julianne's hand, kissing her knuckles, and met his brother's gaze across the wreckage of the corridor. It was a silent, powerful affirmation of their bond. Julianne finally turned, realizing the full consequence of her instinctive action. She rose slowly, facing Reed, who looked less like the untouchable hero and more like a man who had just lost everything. Not his life, but his destiny, his authority, and the woman who should have been his. "Reed," Julianne began, her voice heavy with apology and unvarnished truth. "I was distracted by the secondary trap. I had to ensure Curtis was safe." Reed didn't acknowledge the lie. He looked at the blood on his brother's forehead, the fear in Julianne's eyes, and the possessiveness in Curtis's stance. "You saved my life, Julianne," Reed stated, his voice a low, painful acknowledgement. "You were right about Blackwood, about the flaw, and about the date. But your actions also confirmed the truth of your heart, the one you tried to disguise as duty." He looked directly at Curtis, then back at Julianne. "You rushed to the man you couldn't bear to lose, not the one you came to save. I understand. The mission is completed, but my role in your life, it seems, is over." Julianne felt a wave of relief mixed with profound sorrow. She had saved him, fulfilling her historical duty, but she had lost the idealized dream of a man she had crossed centuries for. The cost was the final, irreversible fracturing of her past loyalty. The royal guards arrived, demanding order and details, pulling the world back from the brink of chaos. Reed, injured but composed, took charge, his duty overriding his personal pain. He would now deal with Blackwood, armed with the evidence Julianne had provided. Julianne, however, remained rooted to the spot, her hand resting protectively on Curtis's arm, her future irrevocably changed by the 3 words she had screamed. "Curtis, get down." The greatest paradox of her journey was solved not by physics, but by the undeniable, visceral truth of love. The hours immediately following the near tragedy at the Crown Assembly were a blur of hushed political maneuvering, hushed panic, and police inquiries. Reed, after receiving rudimentary medical attention for the shoulder wound inflicted by the assassin's glancing blow, immediately reverted to his role as the unflappable pillar of the establishment. He provided crisp, concise testimony, using Julianne's detailed intelligence, carefully stripped of any temporal paradoxes and attributed instead to deep background from a trusted source, to frame the incident not as a random radical act, but as a calculated conspiracy led by Blackwood and his associates. The specificity of the information regarding the East Wing and Blackwood's motive was enough to launch a full investigation, effectively diverting the spotlight from the Donovan family's brief moment of chaos. Curtis, having been cleared of serious injury despite the frightening blow to his head, remained Julianne's shadow. They were inseparable in the hours of intense questioning and political triage, his presence a silent, fierce barrier against the prying eyes of society and the stern gaze of his father. Julianne's mission had been completed, but the cost was the irreversible exposure of her heart. The final, and most profound, reckoning took place late that night in the library of the Donovan estate, the room that had witnessed the start of Julianne's secret alliance with Curtis. The heavy air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and old paper. Lord Donovan had retired, reeling from the realization that his eldest son had been moments from death due to the treachery of their peers. Reed finally dismissed the last of the attending staff, leaving only the three of them, the noble victim, the rogue brother, and the time-traveling savior, to face the altered history they had created. Reed, his arm bound in a clean, tight sling, walked to the fireplace. He looked exhausted, not just physically, but morally. The rigidity that defined him seemed to have softened, replaced by a profound, humbled clarity. He was alive, yes, but the certainty of his ordered world was forever shattered. He had been betrayed by duty's own ranks, and saved by a woman who chose his less revered brother. He turned slowly to face them. Julianne instinctively moved closer to Curtis, a silent declaration of where her loyalty lay. "Blackwood is finished," Reed stated, his voice flat. "The evidence, which Julianne provided, linking him to the Golden Hand and the compromised assembly staff, is conclusive. The conspiracy will be unraveled before dawn. My life is secure, and the Donovan name will emerge stronger for having survived this treachery." He paused, looking directly at Julianne. "You saved me, Julianne. You did what I, with all my rigid commitment to duty and convention, could not do. I dismissed your warnings as feminine fancy. I rejected your help because I could not conceive that I needed protection outside of my own careful sphere. For that pride, I was nearly killed." Julianne lowered her gaze, feeling the weight of his acknowledgement. "It was necessary, Reed. My initial mission was always to prevent that tragedy. And that mission is fulfilled," Reed conceded. He then looked at the silent, protective figure of his brother. "But the nature of that mission changed, did it not? It ceased to be an act of historical correction and became an act of pure, visceral human choice." He walked a few steps closer, his gaze sweeping over the two of them, the physicist from the future and the rogue brother, standing united by their shared recklessness. "When that assassin struck, and the chaos began, I heard your scream," Reed confessed, his voice laced with the painful clarity of the memory. "I heard you cry out, 'Curtis, get down!' You did not scream for the man in the sash. You screamed for the man in the shadows. In that moment of pure, unthinking instinct, you confirmed everything I had dismissed as juvenile distraction and everything my duty prevented me from ever achieving." Curtis began to speak, his protective instincts surging. Reed, Julianne was reacting to the secondary trap. "It was the scaffolding." Reed cut him off with a weary wave of his good hand. "Do not lie for my sake, Curtis. Not tonight. I saw it and I understood it. You were the exposed one, the spontaneous one, the one she truly feared losing. She risked the failure of her historical mission and the exposure of her lifelong secret to save you. No duty, no logic, no historical contract could compel that action. Only love." He looked at Julianne, his gaze surprisingly gentle, stripped of its former rigidity. "I have spent my life fulfilling destiny, Julianne. I live by the dictates of the past and the obligations of the future. But your journey has taught me a painful lesson. That destiny is meaningless if it denies the present truth of the heart. The love you and my brother share is not a distraction. It is the most real, powerful force I have ever witnessed. It saved my life, even as it cost me the woman who should have been my destiny." He took a deep, steadying breath, his voice recovering its formal strength, but now infused with gratitude. "Therefore, Julianne, I grant you my blessing. Your purpose here is fulfilled. My life is secure. My historical fate is averted. The future is no longer burdened by my early death. You are free of your oath, and you are free to choose the man who holds your heart." I will cover your presence here, and I will ensure that your connection to Curtis is seen by my father as a genuine, necessary alliance. Julian felt a profound sense of release. Her great-great-grandfather, the symbol of the past, was not only alive, but had actively sanctioned her choice to embrace a new, unknown future. Her original destiny was definitively undone, but in its place lay the potential for true happiness. Curtis walked away from Julian then, stepping directly to his brother. There was no rivalry left in his eyes, only relief and respect. He clasped Reed's sound shoulder gently. "Thank you, Reed. That means everything," Curtis said simply. "Do not thank me," Reed replied, a faint, almost wistful smile touching his lips. "You finally won the attention of the American. Do not squander it on your charming frivolity. You have found a woman who can see past the sash and the title. Do not force her to live only in the shadows. Your life now has a meaning far greater than mine. You are no longer the spare tire. You are the architect of a new lineage." The use of the word lineage caused Julian's heart to pound. Reed was acknowledging the temporal consequence. The future Julian knew, the one where his death caused centuries of tragedy, was now erased. A new branch had sprouted. A new family line would begin, and it would be with Curtis. She had not only saved her great-great-grandfather, she had chosen her great-great-grandmother's partner. Reed then fixed Julianne with a final, searching gaze. "You have secured my historical survival, Julianne, but you must now choose the final, greatest paradox. What of your time machine? What of the knowledge you brought? Can you truly remain here, severing all ties to the world you knew, and face the absolute uncertainty of a future you no longer control?" The question hung in the air, cold and demanding. Julian knew the answer. The machine was destroyed. She had seen to that, scattering the vital components during her escape from the Crown Assembly, to ensure no one could follow her or trace her path back. Her tie to the 21st century was irrevocably severed. She looked at Curtis, who was now smiling, offering her his hand. The hand of the present, the hand of the future she was now creating. "I will not return, Reed," Julian confirmed, her voice ringing with firm conviction. "The future I left was based on a tragedy I have now averted. It is no longer my home. My destiny was undone the moment I realized my heart was not with the past, but with the present. The only constant worth saving is my own life, and the only certainty I need is Curtis." Curtis stepped forward, drawing her into a fierce, relieved embrace. The silent understanding between them spoke louder than any grand historical decree. Julianne's purpose was fulfilled, her sacrifice acknowledged, and her choice validated by the very man she had traveled across time to protect. The old world was safe, and the new world, her world with Curtis, was finally free to begin. They had secured a future, but it was a future entirely and gloriously their own. The decision to stay was not made in a moment of dramatic pronouncement, but in the quiet, mundane realities of the days following October 27th. The grand, terrifying adventure of time travel and political espionage was over. What remained was the necessity of building a life within a century that was never meant to be Julianne's home. She had dismantled the time machine, scattering its irreplaceable components across London's expansive, grimy river and alleyways, not out of necessity, but as a final, definitive act of commitment. There would be no retreat, no safety net. Her future was here, contingent entirely upon the success of her love for Curtis. Lord Donovan, having absorbed the shock of his eldest son's near assassination and the undeniable necessity of Julianne's intervention, proved remarkably pliable. Faced with the reality of an altered history, the exposure of a major political foe, and the survival of his heir, his social dictates softened. Reed's forceful defense of Julianne and Curtis's connection, framed as a providential alliance, forged in the fires of conspiracy, cemented their status. Julianne was no longer merely the eccentric American cousin. She was the decisive element who had saved the Donovan legacy. The transition from the scientist consumed by duty to the woman embracing desire was a process of slow, sensory reawakening. The tension that had defined Julie and since her arrival, the need to constantly guard her tongue, her posture, her futuristic knowledge, began to ebb. Curtis became her willing tutor and her relentless champion. He taught her the nuances of 19th-century life with a patient, knowing humor, covering the gaps in her knowledge with charming discretion. Julianne, in turn, shared with him the abstract beauty of her abandoned world. The mathematics of the universe, the philosophies of future thinkers, and the vast, unwritten history of the coming century. Their conversations, conducted in whispered secrecy in the garden maze or over chess in the drawing room, were their own private, intellectual universe, a sanctuary where paradox and passion coexisted. The marriage was quiet, almost rushed, a deliberate defiance of the grand aristocratic traditions Reed was bound to uphold. It was held not at a formal London church, but in the small, sun-drenched chapel on the Donovan country estate, away from the prying eyes and judgments of society. Julian wore a simple, cream-colored dress that, while traditional for the time, possessed the streamlined elegance of her own era. Her only adornment was a small, antique silver locket Curtis had given her, containing a tiny, abstract drawing of the spatial temporal coordinates of the Crown Assembly, their secret, shared victory. The ceremony was attended only by Lord Donovan, looking simultaneously exhausted and relieved, and Reed, who arrived late, his arm still in the sling, but his expression genuinely warm. When Julian stood before the altar, facing Curtis, the fear that had been her constant companion finally evaporated. She was marrying a man who knew her secret, who loved her paradox, and who saw her not as a means to an end, but as his greatest beginning. When she looked into Curtis's light, open eyes, she didn't see the rogue. She saw the man who had possessed the courage to challenge destiny, driven by a love that defied centuries. The celebration afterward was equally intimate. It was marked not by extravagant balls, but by a long, relaxed evening in the family's summer drawing room, where the conversation was light, unforced, and completely present. Reed, having shed his official duties for the evening, approached Julianne with a glass of champagne, his gaze thoughtful. "Julianne," he began, "I owe you my life, and I owe my brother his freedom. I accept that you will remain here, and I will, of course, ensure your reputation is unassailable. But I must ask you this, for my own peace of mind. When you look forward now, knowing you have erased the history you knew, do you feel any regret? Any profound fear of the void you have created?" Julian smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that felt alien and wonderful on her face. She looked across the room at Curtis, who was deep in conversation with his father, his movements relaxed, his laughter easy and infectious, the man unburdened by the sash he never wanted to wear. "The history I knew, Reed," she said softly, "was built on your pain, your death, and the sadness that followed. It was a history I was obsessed with fixing, but it was not my own life. The void I created is not terrifying. It is liberating. I chose to trade the certainty of the past for the possibility of the present. And that possibility is here." She raised her glass toward Curtis. The true courage was not traveling through time, but finding the courage to stay and live for the person I became in the process. Reed nodded, his eyes reflecting a hard-won understanding. "Then may the Donovan family's new lineage be long and happy, Julianne. You found a life where I only found a duty." He raised his glass to them both, a final, sincere blessing that sealed the altered historical record. Julianne and Curtis spent the weeks that followed settling into their life at the country estate, far from the suffocating pressure of London society. Their honeymoon was not a grand tour, but a period of joyful, domestic discovery. Julian found a new sense of purpose not in physics, but in gardening and managing the vast, complex household, a complexity that, surprisingly, appealed to her organized scientific mind. Curtis, fueled by the stability and intellectual partnership Julian offered, abandoned his charming rogue persona entirely and began applying his sharp intelligence to managing the family's burgeoning industrial ventures. A pursuit Reed had always dismissed as crude, but which Julian encouraged as the true future of the economy. The final scene of their greatest adventure occurred on a cold, crisp morning on the estate grounds. They were walking hand in hand, their breath misting in the air, discussing Curtis's plans for a new steam-powered loom. "Do you ever wonder what your original timeline looks like now?" Curtis asked, looking out over the misty fields, his voice low with residual curiosity. "Is there a version of us in the 21st century? Or did we simply replace the sad one?" Julian leaned her head on his shoulder, utterly content. "The rules of temporal mechanics are complex, love. Perhaps that past still exists, or perhaps it was absorbed into ours. But the paradox is this. I came here to ensure a noble lineage continued, and I succeeded. I ensured that Reed lived to fulfill his duty, securing the political stability that lasts into our new century. But more importantly, I ensured that a future exists where you and I are together. And that," she concluded, gripping his hand tightly, "is the greatest, most successful temporal correction of all." Curtis stopped, turning to face her, his hands cupping her face, his eyes filled with the depth of their shared history and their chosen future. So, the greatest adventure was not crossing centuries, but choosing to build one, piece by piece, right here. "Exactly," Julian confirmed, a profound peace settling over her. "I ran from the future to the past, only to find my true present. I came here to save the hero, but I ended up saving myself. And that is a love that transcends all timelines." Their lips met, a tender, resolute kiss that sealed their new life. Julianne, the physicist, the time traveler, the woman of paradox, was finally and completely Julian Donovan, the architect of her own destiny, living fully and fiercely in the century she had chosen, right alongside the man who had taught her how to truly live. The past was repaired, the present was secure, and their future, built on the solid foundation of their improbable, undeniable love, stretched out before them, vast and entirely their own. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.